What's up? Currently, I'm traveling, so I'm not in my current area. I'm like, I'm in Utah right now, going to Zion and seeing all the stuff there. And I'm just gonna travel the West Coast mainly for this month because of trading, I guess, and how it's been nice to me. But this flash crash did kind of happen, so I wanted to address it for my journal, kind of. So, obviously, I am approaching this from an optimistic view, because obviously you can approach this from a negative view and be like, okay, the price action is bad, the cycle is over. You have the whatever, like the 4 year cycle, and the 4 year cycle from like bottom to top is over time period wise. So like the cycle's over basically. We just didn't have an all season. And that's one way to look at it, but I am optimistic and I've been optimistic. Like I always thought October was going to be bad and I always thought November and December were going to be good. And until that changes, I'm not really going to deviate from that because October was bad and now the first week of November is bad. But that doesn't mean all of November would be bad and it doesn't mean the cycle's over because I kind of already expected volatility in October. But this volatility and this first month is kind of a lot. So I am going to talk about it and maybe where do I get invalidated if I do, right? So I'll talk about that now from the optimistic perspective, right? That's the perspective I hold. Okay, so I mean, in my opinion, ever since July, Bitcoin has been going down. So it's been about like 4 months. And I really was liking the idea of like the megaphone pattern and it was going to break to the upside and then maybe that was going to be the top. Technically, I mean, you can draw it like however you want and maybe fit it in, but this was kind of the megaphone pattern I was thinking of. And I guess we just wicked below it and we wicked below it again and maybe we can close above it. But um but I do think we are gonna take out these stop losses because I do think there's some stop losses here that need to get taken out. So I do think we will wick below to like 97 maybe or something like that, then go back up. And going back up is my base case. Obviously we could go back up now, but I don't think that's the most likely outcome. But anyways, like if you look at the megaphone pattern, we should be bouncing anytime now. Okay, let me draw it better. I actually want to see if this works out. Sorry. So like let's take like this point all the way here. Oh, wow, that's actually very interesting. Okay. Yeah, see if you do it from like the actual level here, then you're still in. So I really think it's good. And then okay, look, that's 97, right? So that's actually kind of perfect in my opinion. And then we bounce up from there and then maybe go to like 150. But the reason why I think that because obviously there needs to be some reasoning is from the SPY. And basically, there's this statistic that I've been really following that are like, I forgot the statistic. I have it in my paper that I wrote, but it was basically like if January to September is like over 10% gains for the S&P and September is positive, right? Which is sometimes not the case. Then October is usually the choppy week, the choppy month, and then November and December like continue that strength of like the first 3 quarters, right? So it's basically kind of predictive value for Q4 under certain price action for Q1, Q2, Q3, right? And I do think it should have some predictive value because I think in my opinion captures the psychology of the markets and markets under similar conditions. Obviously, you can make the argument that the Fed rate cuts and all of that stuff prices into the market and has some effect. But I do think price action to some extent signifies the Fed cutting rates in the future, the Fed ending QT, the Fed starting QE. Like it kind of has that all baked in. So that's why I think that's kind of what I mean by price action can sometimes capture the context of the markets, and that gives you predictive value if those um, conditions are met again, right? Because it might give you similar context and psychology, stuff like that. Um, so basically, November and December are supposed to be good for the SPY. Unders past a context, they have been good, right? So given we're in a similar context, I think this should also be good. And then SPY to Bitcoin is pretty positively correlated. So I do think Bitcoin, whenever like tech does good, and tech usually has a strong Q4, so tech risk on, like cryptocurrency should start to pick up somewhere, right? Because crypto is pretty risk on. It's pretty much like a high beta tech stock. Um, yeah. So I do think that will happen. Then another reason is, I mean, I've talked about this before, but gold is basically in its pullback time, and I think it'll pull back for another, like just sit around at these levels for another 2 to 3 months, since it basically had euphoric price action. And I think that time of gold sitting should allow risk on, like Bitcoin and stuff, to fly. Um, yeah, so there's that. Um, yeah. So there's that, and then the sentiment. I do think, I mean, obviously this is kind of anecdotal, but I do value my own anecdotes, so obviously I'm gonna mention that in my journal. But basically, the first week of October, everyone was talking about Uptober meme, how Uptober, like October's Uptober, and it will only be up for crypto, and that turned out not to be the case. And the first week of October was very good for price action, and now the first week of November is very bad for price action. So I do think maybe this week being extremely bad, the first week of November being bad, sets us up for a really good November the next 3 weeks. It is just speculation. It could not play out, right? But that is kind of how it played out for October, and I think it could easily play out similarly for November. And then the momentum is carried into December. Just my opinion, though. But I do value that kind of piece. And then sentiment is pretty much at all-time lows, right? And fear of greed, I think we're at 21, and that's very bad. So obviously, like we're around 100K from 126K, so we dropped a few, like 20%, and people are in extreme fear right now. So I do think we are due for a rally, just because sentiment's at dirt levels, and technically I think we're still kind of basically in a bull market, though you can make the argument that momentum is fading. I do think we have one last euphoric run to pull people in, but maybe I'm wrong, and we already had our run and stuff like that. Yeah. So the one thing I want to talk about is the Bitcoin distribution. That was kind of bright, but basically, it shows us the humpback whales, the sharks, then the fish, the crabs, and the shrimp, and basically all of the wallet changes throughout the days, the weeks, and the months. So, basically, I'm going to talk about long-term patterns over the past 2 years. So, if you look at humpback whales, basically since the beginning of, well, you can make the argument at the beginning of 2024 they accumulated a lot, but then they dumped. Ever since like middle of 2024 all the way till now, they've been dumping Bitcoin. And then the same for whales, right? Ever since 2024, they've been dumping Bitcoin. So the whales and the humpback whales have been dumping their Bitcoin. But if you look at the sharks, which are 100 to 1,000 Bitcoin, which is like 10 million to 100 million, right? Um, they went from 4 billion Bitcoin accumulated to 5 million in just a year, right? So they increased their position by 25% on average, whereas whales went from 4.85 to 4.25, and then humpback whales went from 3 million to 2.8 million. So this is kind of like pretty consistent if you ask me. And then whales have been kind of dumping a lot, but the sharks have been really eating all of that up, right? And the whole way I kind of think of this is humpback whales and whales are kind of the originators, right? Like when you look at when these whales accumulated, they accumulated in 2018, 2019, right? And they continue to accumulate until 2021. And then they've been basically selling since 2021. And they just increased their selling a lot this year, right? And if you look at the humpback whales, they accumulated basically from 2014 all the way to 2018, and then they stopped accumulating and started dumping basically since 2018, right? So I really do think this is just another um, old money to new money. So there's just a transfer of Bitcoin from old holders to new holders, and the new holders being sharks. And then if you look at more of like our type of traders, like fish, the crab, and the shrimp, we've basically been steady. If you look at the fish, they went from 4.45 in 2023 to 4.3. So they've actually are net down Bitcoin, which I thought was interesting considering this huge rally, right? Um, and then ever since 2025, crabs are basically slightly down, like barely down, right? Shrimp are barely down also, but the but it's interesting because they really haven't been accumulating at all. Because if you look at shrimp, they've been steadily accumulating since 2014, and they basically just stopped since 2025, which I thought was very interesting. But my whole idea is like these people have been really accumulating at these levels, and most likely they're not wrong. I think this is just a transfer of wealth from whales to sharks, and then the sharks might manipulate it somehow or something like that. Um, I do think like like here we could see like pretty much euphoric accumulation in shrimp, right? You couldn't really see it in 2021, but my kind of idea is that whenever shrimp start accumulating again, that is probably when the top is in. Just because they sold into the 60K Bitcoin, they sold into the 100K Bitcoin, but let's say we go to 150K Bitcoin, if they start buying at those prices, the top is probably in my opinion. Just my opinion. Just because we kind of saw that in 2021, where basically, I guess they've been steadily accumulating, but there was a time where they sold their Bitcoin, then they rebought it back at higher levels, and that was kind of when the top was in. Then they bought the dip, obviously, in the bear market, but they've been basically selling. They've been basically net sellers since 2024, and I think whenever like we get a meaningful uptick in data, that's when euphoria is back in, and stuff like that. You really can't see it for crab, honestly, and you can't really see it. Maybe when fish start dumping a lot, that's when the top is in, because they actually sold that and then they bought back at the lows, but they've been pretty much slowly selling, but they haven't like sold like they did in 2021. But basically, the chances of it topping in I think are pretty low. Sharks haven't been selling. They've been basically just buying all of this Bitcoin up. But that's kind of my theory on the supply and demand thing. Yeah, but basically, um, basically what I thought was interesting was that since today was like extremely red for Bitcoin, right? Humpback whales bought a lot this day. They bought a lot this week, and they bought a lot this month, which this like the past 30 days have not been good, very good for Bitcoin. So they've really been buying this dip, right? Humpback whales have. Whales actually bought this dip too. They've been net sellers on the week and the month though, heavy net sellers, right? And then the sharks, this day and the week have been net sellers, but on the month they're basically up so much, right? And then fish are have been net sellers. Um, yeah, yeah, which is very interesting. But yeah, I really do think all of this is kind of kind of just old money going into new money accumulation distribution style. And I think the sharks are not wrong, and eventually like even they had this big uptick, right? Like the humpback whales, and I don't know, like it looks like the humpback whales are saving some Bitcoin to sell later, because there really hasn't been a drop off like there was in 2021 where they had a huge like drop down. Like even I guess here it doesn't really apply, but something like 2021, like they were net sellers for years, then they really sold off a lot. And I do think something like that might happen again. But this is all speculation, but I don't think this drop is too concerning. I am kind of like trying to fit a narrative. Maybe I am trying to think of that, but I really do. Like the whole reason I got into the Bitcoin trade to begin with was because I believed in what I talked about earlier. This Bitcoin distribution thing is just something I've seen recently, and maybe explains some of the selling, because I do think a lot of the price action is based off of the whale and shark distribution and accumulation. So yeah, thought it was interesting, and yeah, thanks if you watched.